Welcome to the 1515, a 15-minute podcast brought to you by the regulatory legal experts at the Maples Group. Here, you will learn more about the latest developments in the regulatory laws of the Cayman Islands on the 15th day of every month.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Chris Capewell, and I'm the Global Head of the Regulatory and Financial Services Group for Maples and Calder. In today's podcast, we're going to spend a good amount of time and get some valuable insights from the team here as they relate to regulatory developments in the British Virgin Islands. In particular, the listeners may be aware that on the 26th of February of this year, the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force, which we call FATF, published its fourth round mutual evaluation report on AML and counter-terrorist financing measures in the British Virgin Islands, and that was following an on-site inspection by FATF of the BVI from between, I think it was 15 to 30 March 2023. So for today's podcast, we thought it would be useful to cover three main areas. Firstly, we're going to provide a high-level overview of the BVI FATF report. If you've had the pleasure of reading it, it extends for more than 200 pages. So this podcast should hopefully be a useful summary of that. Secondly, we're also going to share our experience from the Cayman Islands FATF report, which was released in March 2019, and what our observations were in subsequent years, including eventual delisting from the FATF grey list. And then finally, we're just going to touch on some recent developments that we've seen with the Virgin Islands International Tax Authority, particularly as it relates to CRS. Joining me on today's podcast are a number of BVI experts. We have my fellow partners, Chris Newton and Matt Gilbert. Chris is the managing partner of our BVI office and is based in the BVI. And Matt Gilbert is a partner based in our London office. We also have two senior associates, Nikki Wood and Daniel Moore. Nikki is based in the Cayman Islands and Daniel is based in our Hong Kong office. And last, but by no means least, we have Alice Reid, who is a senior vice president at Maples FS in the Maples Compliance Services team. Please do note that the contents of today's podcast do not constitute legal advice and should be taken as a general update only. Before we get going, just some very light housekeeping matters to cover. If you are listening from your usual podcast app, you'll find any resources, documents that we reference, including a high-level copy of some presentation slides and speaker information in the description. And if you clicked on the media link that was sent to you via email, you can find this information in the notes section. Please do not forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Okay, let's get started. Dan, over to you first. We're going to be talking about AML, terrorist financing, proliferation financing. I guess just at a very basic level, it would be good if you can track us through what the key concepts are and what they mean.
Thank you, Chris. Some of those key concepts are money laundering, which is the processing of criminal proceeds to disguise their illegal origin. Terrorist financing, which is the financing of terrorist acts and terrorist organizations. Proliferation financing is financing the transfer and export of nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons and related activities. And targeted financial sanctions, which are asset freezing and prohibitions to prevent funds from being made available directly or indirectly for the benefit of persons and entities named on sanctions list. In terms of who the FATF is, the FATF is the global money laundering, terrorist, and proliferation financing watchdog. The FATF researches how money is laundered and how terrorism is funded and promotes global standards to mitigate the risks. Also, and relevant to the BVI report, the FATF assesses whether countries are taking effective action in the fight against money laundering and terrorist financing. And why is this important? Well, firstly, the FATF is a primary source for assessing the quality of a country's legal and institutional AML and terrorist financing framework and its application in practice. And secondly, governments, regulatory bodies, and financial institutions use FATF's findings in their own assessments of risk for money laundering, counter-terrorist financing, and counter-proliferation financing. Moving to the methodology used in the report itself, the FATF conducts mutual evaluations of all its members' levels of implementation of the FATF recommendations on an ongoing basis. They're mutual because they are peer reviews, where members from different countries assess another country. And the assessments focus on two main areas. Firstly, effectiveness, and secondly, technical compliance. The real emphasis of any assessment is on effectiveness. A country must demonstrate that in the context of the risks it is exposed to, it has an effective framework to protect its financial system from abuse. The assessment team looks at 11 key areas, or what they call immediate outcomes, which will determine the level of effectiveness of a country's efforts. The assessment also looks at whether a country has met all the technical requirements of each of the 40 FATF recommendations by its laws, regulations, and other legal measures to combat money laundering and terrorist financing. In summary, a mutual evaluation report provides an in-depth description and analysis of a country's system for preventing criminal abuse of the financial system, as well as focused recommendations to that country to further strengthen its system. I'll now hand over to Chris Newton, who will talk us through how the BVI was rated in the FATF report and the immediate response that we have seen from the BVI government.
Thanks, Dan. In terms of the outcomes coming from the report, there was two main areas that we're going to talk about today. So the first was technical compliance ratings. This really relates to the rule book of the BVI, our statutes, our regulations, and our laws. The BVI was found to be fully compliant or largely compliant with 36 of the 40 recommendations. Within that, there were 11 fully compliant ratings and 25 partially compliant ratings. To put that into a global perspective, this leaves the BVI ranked above Canada, Ireland, the US, and Australia from a technical compliance perspective. In terms of the effectiveness ratings, this is really the implementation of those rules that we've just talked about. The BVI received 4 moderate ratings and 7 low ratings. Taking all of that together, what the report shows us is that whilst the technical compliance aspect of the BVI wasn't too bad and in some places actually quite good, it's the effectiveness ratings where more work needs to be done in the jurisdiction. And that's where we'd expect to see the focus going forwards. To support that focus, the response from BVI government has been immediate and decisive. Steps we've already seen taken, some of which came in on the day of the report itself. The Premier and the Minister for Financial Services welcoming the report and confirming the government's commitment to the implementation of the same. We've also seen releasing of the BVI National Action Plan, setting out the steps that the BVI is going to take to focus on, in particular, its effectiveness ratings and also the timeline for completion of those steps. My colleagues Nikki and Matt will talk about these topics in more detail. However, on a high level, where we're expecting to see things go now is the BVI regulatory agencies really focusing on that effectiveness aspect and taking the steps in the National Implementation Report to enforce the regulatory laws of the BVI.
Thanks, Chris. I shall focus on the 3 partially compliant ratings in the report. So this is the technical effectiveness. Firstly, there were the recommendation 24, transparency and beneficial ownership of legal persons. The main deficiency identified in this report was the inability to access whether information on beneficial ownership was being adequately and accurately maintained by the registered office. This was due to the low number of inspections by the Financial Services Commission. Another observation is that direct information is not collected at the outset when a company is incorporated, which impacts the timely availability of the information. The beneficial ownership information is also collected on a risk-sensitive approach in terms of the client due diligence, which means that the information does not ensure that it's adequate, accurate, and up-to-date. The FATF inspectors also identified gaps with foreign companies, nominee shares, and cooperative societies or friendly societies. The other partially compliant rating was in relation to recommendation 26, the regulation and supervision of financial institutions. The FATF inspectors noted that trading in foreign exchange is not actually covered under sectoral legislation and that there are deficiencies in the prevention of criminals and their associates from entering the financial sector, and that the Financial Services Commission is not held to review in the assessment of financial institutions' risk profile, even when there are major developments or events in the management of the entity or the group. The third recommendation, of which was partially compliant, was in relation to recommendation 28, the regulation and supervision of designated non-financial businesses and professionals. The Financial Investigation Agency, it was noted, doesn't have adequate powers to enter premises of designated non-financial businesses and professionals to search and take possession of copies or documents unless they have a magistrate's order. Designated financial businesses and professionals are not required to get the Financial Investigation Agency's approval based on fitness and propriety prior to appointing directors, senior officers, or persons holding significant or controlling interest. It was therefore deemed that the Financial Investigation Agency lacked sufficient powers of enforcement, where it couldn't withdraw or suspend a license, authorization, or registration. The Financial Investigation Agency also is not required to conduct supervision on a risk-sensitive basis, nor was such a process systematically applied. We have now actually seen the Financial Investigation Agency serving notices for inspections. The one non-compliant rating was recommendation 8 on not-for-profit organisations, where it was stated that the BVI has major shortcomings in its approach to and regulation and supervision of not-for-profits. So I'll now pass you over to Matt Gilbert, who's a partner in our finance team, who'll talk about the reactions to the BVI FATF report.
Thanks, Nikki. So one question many clients are considering is whether BVI will be added to the FATF monitoring list, which is the list of jurisdictions under increased monitoring in the area of anti-money laundering, countering terrorist and proliferation financing. This list, which is sometimes referred to as FATF's grey list, comprises jurisdictions that are actively working with FATF to address strategic deficiencies in their AML, countering terrorist and proliferation finance regimes. At this stage, it's too early to assess whether BVI will be added to the grey list, but our understanding is that if this step is to be taken, the timeframe would be 2025 as opposed to this year. As a firm, Maples has got great experience in this area as a result of the Cayman Islands being added to the FATF grey list back in 2021. The Cayman Islands has now successfully completed all recommended actions and meets the global FATF standard for AML, countering terrorist financing and countering proliferation financing, and sanctions laws, regulations and controls. Many of our cross-office regulatory team worked closely over the last few years with the Cayman government and industry bodies and clients to achieve this. Leveraging off our experience in this team, our expectation is that regardless of the position of BVI on the FATF list, then in line with the National Action Plan, we can expect to see an increase in the following areas which may impact clients. Firstly, entities being subject to regulatory oversight. Secondly, AML questionnaires from the regulators. And thirdly, more requests for assistance with AML, countering terrorist financing and countering proliferation financing, as well as sanctions, questionnaires, risk assessments, policies and procedures, training, audits and inspections. In BVI, the FSC has already announced the launch of its 2024-2025 inspection plan. The primary focus of this will be mitigating money laundering, terrorist financing and proliferation financing risks identified in risk assessments. For this inspection cycle, the FSC intends to visit approximately 50 licensees. However, they've indicated it may conduct more inspections if additional risks are identified. Inspections will cover all sectors, but will be focused on trust and corporate service providers and investment business, which are known to pose a higher risk for money laundering, terrorist financing and proliferation financing. On-site inspections will focus on a few areas, in particular reliance on third parties, assessment of customer due diligence, verification of legal persons and arrangements, risk assessment including customer and institutional risk, and overall compliance with AML and counter-terrorist financing controls. The priority areas for desk-based reviews will be nominee shareholder services, nominee directorship services, and sanctions compliance. Now, let me introduce Alice Reid of Maples Compliance Services, who can tell you a little more about how Maples can assist you.
Thanks, Matt. Maples Compliance Services Limited is one of the largest providers of AML compliance services. We do have teams in Hong Kong, Montreal, Dublin, and Cayman. We provide money laundering reporting officers for entities carrying out relevant business in or from the BVI. Some of those entities that we have expertise with is investment fund vehicles and investment managers. This service of providing MLRO prepares board reports. These board reports will summarize the AML framework of the entity. The reports are done either quarterly, annually, or as the client prefers. The MLRO will present this report at the board meetings. The MLRO will also facilitate any external or internal suspicious activity reporting and will, of course, field any follow-up or queries from the FSC. Please do reach out to any of your Maples contacts for more information on how we can assist with providing our MLRO services or any other compliance-related services.
Thanks, Alice, and thanks, team. Similar to what Matt mentioned with his observations from Cayman, outside of the FATF and FATF report, What we are seeing is the International Tax Authority and the BVI is currently undertaking an exercise and reaching out to various entities where they've obtained a GIN in the US pursuant to US FATCA, and that's publicly available, that list. So the International Tax Authority is looking at that list at BVI entities and cross-comparing to its own list and querying with clients why they've registered for a GIN in the US and they haven't registered in the BVI as a Virgin Islands financial institution. So to the extent that you have a BVI entity that is registered as an FI, this is definitely a focus area for the International Tax Authority. They are reaching out to a number of different entities, querying the inconsistency of registering under the US, but not registering as a Virgin Islands financial institution. And from the Cayman experience, I think probably where we're going to get to is more and more queries around different areas, particularly to show enforcement relating to the effectiveness assessment that Chris and Matt both talked about. And CRS and FATCA is one of those. So we definitely recommend revisiting where you're at on CRS, both in terms of registration, policies, procedures, whether you've reported the required accounts, because that's a fairly easy way for the ITA to cross-compare publicly available lists. Okay, that's it. Thanks to Dan, Chris, Nikki, Matt, and Alice. We're happy to help in any way that we can. Got a global regulatory team with a lot of the team on this call. Dual qualified, for example, both in Cayman and BVI. Alice on the Maples FS side. And we'll be in contact soon with another BVI dedicated podcast. Thank you.